Webinar Talk Show. I'm Liz Green.
And I am Tom Singer, and I'm glad to have Eliz back. She was gone last week on vacation, and I had to do these interviews. I had to do them all alone. So thank you.
Sad.
Thank you for coming back.
I'm glad to be back. A week of social distance or physical distancing on a sailboat was a nice break. My husband needs that distance, the physical distance from work, in order to actually disconnect from what's causing him stress. So it was
So
really
sailing
nice.
away on a boat is the way to go.
Yeah, especially since he's working from home, there is no escape. So being able to actually physically escape was really a wonderful thing to be able to do.
Nice. Well, I did miss you. We still had webinar talk show interviews, but it wasn't as much fun without you sitting here
Oh.
with me talking to our guests.
Well, I will admit to a little bit of jealousy because sometimes I had data when you went live, and I'm like,
He's live without me.
without me. But I got over it.
You're back, and we have a great show today.
We do. One of the things, as I'm doing final edits on my book called Stress Proof Your Life, I was working on the section about how stress is caused by uncertainty. And Lisa Haen, our guest today, is back to talk about the way that we react or respond. Those are two different things. This is something I've learned, reacting and responding, two different things to hazardous, dangerous, or unsafe situations. She has spent her whole career in different types of organizations creating a safety of culture, a culture of safety. Did that backwards, and really now has brought that experience into helping companies create cultures that are agile enough to deal with the changes that are coming along. And there's been some changes lately.
Yeah, there've been a lot of changes the last 4 months.
There have, and it continues to change. And now, as it feels like struggling to figure out how to move into having our businesses open and just dealing with the situation that we've been dealt right now. I think we're all feeling, we got used to what was happening before, and now it's changing again, and it's starting to feel uncertain and not secure, which causes stress, which makes us less productive, less creative. We don't think as critically if we're stressed. So I thought it was a great idea to bring Lisa back and talk about how do you create that safe environment so your people can work well. Welcome to the Webinar Talk Show again, Lisa Haen.
I think you're our first repeat guest.
Yes.
Ooh.
Woohoo!
Thank you.
Very cool.
Happy to be here.
Glad to have you.
Thanks.
So Lisa, let's start off with this. When you work with an organization, and let's say you have a lot of experience working, for example, with utility organizations, what do you think is the most important thing when creating that environment of safety?
Well, we are living through historical times, and as the facts become revealed to us, along with that comes that misinformation. So mask, no mask, social distance, social events, political views, civil unrest. So we're being challenged on a physical, emotional, and a financial level. And our roller coaster emotions are pretty raw, right?
Yes.
Leaders are challenged to, en route disrupted supply chains. I don't know about you, but I tried to get a freezer. My freezer in my garage died, and I needed a new one. And I'm waiting 2 months for a new freezer.
Yeah.
So supply chains are really disrupted. Enabling remote workforces. We've all got distractions in the workplace. It's not like we're at home and the kids are out doing their thing and going to school or going to daycare. We've got spouses that are also working at home, so that remote workforce is really challenging for some of us. Some of us work really well in it, so there's a divide there. Safeguarding essential employees. So we got to keep the country moving, right? And essential workers have been spotlighted, and that's a good thing because we can see now what are the core elements of operation. in our living world. And then, some leaders have to break bad news and let employees go. So there's a lot of stress there. And so no wonder we're all exhausted, right?
Right.
So when we think about safety and security in the workplace, there are a lot of leaders that we look to, OSHA, CDC. There are guidelines that we want to follow. And the core of what we need to do as leadership is to make sure that we address three things. So we need to assess the risk. So what is the exposure, the likely exposure that our employees will endure through their process of work if they are returning to work? And then controls. There are administrative controls like staggered work shifts and the virtual workplace. Mm-hmm. And then there are engineering controls, which are physical barriers. We've seen the plexiglass at the right. market. I went to the post office and there was, there's markers on the floor staying 6 feet away from the counter. And in the control element, from a staggered work shift perspective, you talked about utilities. Work crews are often before COVID, work crews were assigned daily. So this crew would be working on this and this crew would be working on that. And the next day they would shift and different crews would be on different projects. So what we see now is that we have work crews that are assigned and they stay assigned in all of the things that we do. So if you've got a work crew, we don't split them up anymore. So those are just a few of the things that we're doing from a physical barrier and from a staggered work shift. And then the last thing is communication of care. Mm-hmm. We've heard this, and I'm making assumptions that leaders are communicating with their employees on a regular basis, but that's not always the case. Mm-hmm. So one of the discussions that I had recently was there was a leader of an organization who was on a talk show for one of their folks that they wanted to display information and share what their company was doing. And in the course of the interview, the CEO revealed that there were a certain number of positive cases of COVID at a certain location, and the employees first heard about that through this interview.
Oh,
so
that's bad.
Yeah. So I think communicating with care and trying to meet the employees where they live is important. So those are just some of the tip of the iceberg things that leaders need to be thinking about as we bring people back to work or as we continue to leverage safety in the workplace for essential workers.
So Lisa, you touched on this whole idea of communication, and the thing that stood out to me is we're 4 months into this.
Yep.
Shouldn't that have been tackled by now? Is how do we communicate and not tell people your coworkers have COVID while I'm being interviewed on CNN?
It should be. You would think it would be elementary, but the challenges that we're seeing in terms of leadership are, there's an exhaustion level. There's so much information coming at us. There's so many changes that we're having to adapt to that leaders are dealing with fear, uncertainty, and that exhaustion. And sometimes less is more, and sometimes more is more. So communicating is really important on a regular basis, consistency to build that trust with employees. So no, to your question, Tom, leaders are not, getting on that bandwagon of consistent communications. It's unfortunate.
I think that exhaustion is in both parties, right? Leaders are exhausted, everybody is exhausted, frankly. And I remember when you were with us before, you were talking about that communication not just being the messaging part, but also the listening part.
Yes.
I feel like that's maybe the part that's often missing is you talked about how to talk to your employees in a way that elicits that feedback, that you're asking questions so that you are actually learning what's going on.
Right.
how do you do that as you're, let's say, implementing, whether it's the barriers or this is how we're going to deal with the public that comes into our store or whatever it is? How do you make that something that the employee feels like they're being communicated with rather than just being told what to do? Because we all react to that really well.
Yeah. Well, I think you hit a nerve there, because oftentimes leaders, especially the middle managers,
Mm-hmm.
get the information from the top. Legal says this, we have to do this. The CDC says this, we have to protect our workers. They feel sometimes like they're the messenger
Mm-hmm.
when they need to have that communication of care. So meeting them where they're at, listening to what they're not saying, listening to their concerns. We have employees working from home with challenges. We have essential workers that have compromised people at home. So listening to what their concerns are from an individual perspective instead of the whole team perspective is really important. And I think for the most part, leaders who do that well are benefiting from that buy-in from the employees. They understand
Right.
that the leader cares about them, and they're contributing to that wellness perspective. So OSHA is the governing force when we talk about workplace safety, and employees have a right to work in a safe and healthy workplace. So I think the challenge for leaders, at least the ones that I've been talking to, is how do we define that? How do we
Mm.
define a safe and healthy workplace when there's misinformation, when there's challenging facts that we have to try to incorporate into our workplace, and embracing change and recognizing that our work cultures look different and will most likely continue to look different in the future, that the getting back to normal is gone, right? We all thought
Yeah.
in March that, just a few months of this and we'll get back to normal. There is no getting back to normal. It will be a constant change for some time. So trying to, meet the employee where they are, to recognize that this is a tremendous change that we're going through historical times, and then console them and include them in some of the decisions that are being made in the workplace. That will really reflect well as we go through these continual changes.
So this is, in full disclosure, Lisa and I have spent a lot of time talking about these issues.
Mhm.
Um, and one of the things that I think is challenging, particularly about COVID, is that it is an invisible risk. You you can't see it. And yesterday we were talking about the invisible risk in an confined space and how you help people be safe in that environment, because that too is an invisible risk. Could you, for the benefit of the rest of us, could you
Sure.
sort of talk about that and how you structure creating that process so that people can be safe working in a hazardous environment?
Right. So when we do safety training or look at workplace hazards, there are steps we take. It's the same 3 steps that I just shared. So we assess the risk, we determine what could possibly happen, what
Mm-hmm.
outcomes, hazardous outcomes could occur in the course of completing that task. And then we control things. So we environmentally or administratively control them. And then we communicate and train based on those hazards. So in a confined space, the hazard is often unseen because it includes bad air. And when you have a confined space, think of a manhole or a sewer manhole.
Mm-hmm.
When you open the cover and you look in the hole, it doesn't look dangerous because it looks like the air that we're breathing up top. But what happens in that space is there could be bad air, oftentimes lying at the bottom. So we have certain controls that we use, an air monitor, for example, that we drop down into the hole and we get readings and see if there's any bad air down there that's going to impact us and our breathing and our ability to perform the job. And then we control those things. So if there's bad air, we measure, then we do a flush of the air. So we ventilate and we make sure that we don't send anyone into that space until that ventilation reads clear in terms of then the metering. So when we look at those kind of controls, we have to think about the same thing with COVID. We can't see it. Mm-hmm. There's nothing we can do to see the black lights, nothing. Right? So we have to protect against it. And so those controls that we're thinking about, the 3 controls that the CDC recommends and has caused a lot of controversy is wearing a mask, staying 6 feet away, and washing our hands. So when we think about the confined space, we want to make sure that we're protecting our employees from the bad air, from bad things happening, and we control those measures and we train to that. That way employees will stop and control and then perform the job safely. So converting that to COVID, we need to stop and think about where are our risks? What are our employees going to face in terms of potential exposures, and how do we control that? So again, the mask, lots of controversy again, but the CDC and the experts do say that wearing some kind of a barrier helps other people from your droplets if you are in fact infected. And we don't know if we're infected for 14 days. So I think that's the rub. That's, I mean, in a confined space, you can test right away.
Right.
You know it's there. 14 days, that's a challenge.
So Lisa, I don't want to get into the whole controversy of how this all got politicized, right?
Yeah,
but
unfortunate.
You talk about culture, and how do we keep politics out of the culture and stick to the science when it comes to safety?
We take the human element out of it. Because the bottom line is we're all human and we all have our belief systems, right? And we bring those belief systems into the workplace.
Right.
So when we bring our belief systems into the workplace, it does cloud the vision. And I think that that is one of the challenges when we look at the facts. Going back to the confined space, we have facts. We know these things are bad. These things happen as a result of the conditions, and this is how we control it. When we think about the culture and dealing with human beings and their beliefs and values, we really have to try hard to stick to the facts. And if we stick to the facts, then we will be able to communicate the essential need to do what we need to do. If we cloud the water and allow that stuff to creep in, we're going to be very circular in behavior. So think about 2 people talking about the mask situation. We've got both sides of the issue. You got somebody who thinks, I herd immunity, my doctor says I have a condition, all of those things. And then you've got the other side to say, I've got somebody compromised. I want to make sure I do the right thing because if I could infect someone, I want to prevent that. So bringing those discussions to the workplace is difficult because you're not going to change people's mind oftentimes because they feel very grounded in their beliefs. So then as leaders, what we need to do is we need to look at, again, assessing that risk, controlling as best we can, and then communicating with care.
So taking the mask issue out of our conversation right now and the politics around that, as our society has gotten so polarized over the last 4, 6, maybe 10 years, do you see that sort of political polarization impacting cultures before COVID within companies and therefore impacting safety?
Before COVID, politics wasn't really as much of an issue because it was personal. It was personal to me, it was personal to the individuals. This controversy has become more global. So we're seeing more discussions elevated, beliefs and values elevated because we're in fear and we're trying very hard to protect ourselves. So what I see is Having these conversations in a healthy way is productive. Having these conversations in an escalated way is harmful. So we need to really think about, as leaders, how are we coming at it? Are we coming at it with our belief systems, or are we coming at it from an organizational perspective? Because organizationally, again, going back to OSHA, we have a responsibility to protect our workforce. So that means safety and health. And that's what the employer needs to do. So communicating that to employees, that we care about your health. And as a result, these are the findings that we came up with, because you want to be very transparent to build that trust. So here are the risks assessed. Here are the controls we're putting in place, and this is why. And typically that will help ease that fear in the employee, in the individual. And then the other thing that I recommend is include the employee. So to your point, Tom, politics, don't let that cloud the water. Try to have those conversations, removing that, addressing it because it's real for the individual, but then removing it from the conversation of assess risk, controls, and then communication.
I remember, though, from our conversations over the years that oftentimes the way you've delivered that message about, no, I need you to do it this way, because not because OSHA says it's the right way or I say it's the right way, because I care about you. And I remember the story about the younger worker asking the guy to come down in the cherry pick. So if you could share that story, or any other one that you want to share, just about how that safety culture isn't a bunch of rules necessarily.
Yeah, there's a distinct difference between policy and culture behavior. Okay. Mm-hmm. You can put all the policies in place, but that doesn't mean your employees are going to follow that policy or buy into that policy or believe that policy. We have a business to run, so it's important to have policies, but the scale of influence that not only leaders have, but also employees have is critical. So the conversation that you're referring to is, there were two linemen. One was a veteran and one was an apprentice, and you do apprenticeship before you get to be a journeyman in the hierarchy of the controls there. So when you're an apprentice, you're learning under a journeyman. And sometimes in the utility world, the journeymen are very set in their ways. They have been through a lot. They sometimes normalize the risk. So normalizing the risk is, I've done something 365 times, nothing's happened, it must be safe, until it isn't. So normalizing that risk is something that we see with the veteran employees. The new employees have a fresh perspective. They have, they just came out of school, or they have some, dialogue with other people that are new in the industry, and they're book smart, but they're not experienced smart. So to influence, sometimes the journeyman will say, this is this and this is that, and I'll show you the ropes. Sometimes it goes the other way. Sometimes the apprentice comes in and tries to teach the journeyman some things about the new process, okay? So in this particular case, there was a journeyman, a veteran employee, and a new apprentice, and they were up in the buckets. They were in an elevated position working on the lines. And we're
talking electrical lines.
Yes, electrical lines. And there's something called cover up. So you have a span of line, and you cover them up in order to work safely around that energized equipment, because you don't shut down the power, because we would take away power from businesses and homes. So we have to work it hot. So when you're working hot, you cover up so that you don't touch things or do something that's unsafe. Again, those physical barriers, those engineering controls. So this particular apprentice was up on the line with a journeyman and went to cover up. And the journeyman said, we don't need cover up. This is a quick job, and wasn't going to buy into the cover up. The apprentice did want to cover up and covered up his line, and the journeyman did not.
Mm.
So when you're working on a span, you're a distance away, but if there's an arc flash, which is the hazard associated with this type of hot work, if there's an arc flash, it's hotter than, it's 3 times the surface of the sun is in terms of heat, and it scatters. So the apprentice would have been impacted if the journeyman would have contacted a line inadvertently. So the apprentice knew that I'm not getting through this journeyman. He's not going to cover up. It's, you know, he's set in his ways. His belief system is such that he's not going to change. So the journeyman said, or the apprentice said, would you meet me down at the ground? Let's take a break. So they lowered their buckets to the ground, and the apprentice reached for his wallet, took out his wallet, and showed him a picture of his family and said, this is why I cover up. And it's really important that I go home to them. So would you mind covering up just for this job? And the way that this apprentice approached the journeyman really kind of softened that exterior about, this is the way we do it. This, you know, you don't need that, you know, you're not in school anymore, kind of a concept. And he influenced that journeyman to take a fresh perspective of what he was doing so that he could protect and strengthen that relationship between him and the apprentice. So influencing and showing personal aspects of why it's important is very powerful in trying to explain how we feel about the safety of our work environment.
That story, I mean, it was like, wow, now I know why Eliz wanted you to tell that story.
Right.
I think that in this crazy world we're in right now, and this argument around things like who wears a mask and whose right it is not to, I think we should take that story, just clip it out and put it all over social media, because that's the answer, is we all need to go home to those people. So we all need to watch out for the next guy, aside from what I believe. So that was great. Lisa, as we wrap this up, any last little message about culture and safety that you feel we need to share with everybody?
Well, I think in closing, just making sure that we take good care of ourselves. I think just like and airplanes, we'll someday get back on a plane, but that whole concept of when the mask drops.
I so badly want to be back on an airplane. I used to travel 100 nights a year, and people are like, how do you do that? The question should be, how do you not do that?
Exactly. But when an oxygen mask falls, they always say, take care of yourself first. So, you know, recognizing the fact that we are all in this together, that everyone in the world is experiencing this pandemic. Everyone in the world is experiencing the misinformation, the belief systems. And so just taking a step back and caring for ourselves and checking our own emotions, and then doing the due diligence that it takes to keep those employees under your protection safe and healthy, by assessing the risk, controlling the environment, and then communicating with care. Very important.
Love it. Love it. I knew this was going to be good.
Well, there's more where that comes from.
It is true. Lisa has some of the best stories. Ones that I think about, I often, in full disclosure, as I am doing something the way that Lisa has told me I should be doing something, will send her a picture of my wearing the appropriate ventilator, or, you know, tying off to something, or actually not doing something that I shouldn't. I will send and say, see, I'm being safe, because I do listen, because we should all listen to Lisa Haen.
Yeah, and I appreciate that. It's good to know that you're protecting yourself, because we are responsible for our own protection. So making those choices is important. So thank you.
Lisa, if somebody wanted more of this amazing information, where would they find you?
They can find me at cultureinsideout.com.
cultureinsideout.com. Go check it out. So again, Lisa, thank you so much for joining us for a second time on the Webinar Talk.
Thank you. It's been a
and
pleasure.
We'll be back next week with more amazing people to interview. Tom, if they wanted to find more information about us, where would they go?
They can go to webinartalkshow.com. They also should subscribe to the Facebook page and tell all their friends to subscribe to the Facebook
Yes.
page, because we always live stream these, and we've said it on almost every episode. A webinar should and could be more than a talking head over PowerPoint. And when you get
Absolutely.
to the in-depth interviews, that's where you get to the aha moments like we had with Lisa today.
Perfect. We'll see you next week. Have a good week until then. Thanks for joining us.